Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight we're going to journey into a mystery, a historical enigma that continues to puzzle and fascinate us, decades later. What truly happened in the seemingly golden age of the 1920s that led to such a catastrophic fall? How did an era of unparalleled optimism suddenly plunge into an abyss of despair? Before we start, I would like to know where you are watching this video from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, while you are at it, please do like and subscribe, so we can bring out more content like this. Now let's get started. In the annals of American history, few decades shimmer with as much paradoxical allure as the 1920s. It was a time that roared with unprecedented prosperity, a period of intoxicating optimism that in retrospect feels almost mythical. Emerging from the crucible of the First World War, the United States found itself in a uniquely advantageous position. While Europe lay in ruins, grappling with the immense human and economic costs of the conflict, America had transitioned from a debtor nation to the world's leading creditor. Its factories, having churned out war material for the Allies, were now retooled for peacetime production, ready to satisfy a burgeoning domestic demand and an eager global market. The war had ironically spurred innovation and efficiency, setting the stage for an economic boom unlike any seen before. This was the era of the New Era philosophy, a widespread belief that the old rules of economics, the cyclical patterns of boom and bust, had been permanently vanquished, replaced by an unending upward trajectory of wealth and progress. The very air seemed to crackle with possibility. A sense of liberation permeated society, a loosening of old strictures that found expression in the Jazz Age, the flapper, and the widespread embrace of new freedoms. But beneath the glittering surface of speakeasies and dance halls, a far more profound transformation was underway, the birth of modern consumer culture. For the first time, a vast array of goods, once luxuries, became accessible to the average American household. The assembly line, perfected by Henry Ford, had revolutionized manufacturing, making products cheaper and more plentiful than ever imagined. The automobile, once a plaything for the wealthy, was now within reach of the middle class, transforming landscapes and lifestyles. Ford's Model T, a symbol of this new industrial prowess, rolled off the lines with astonishing speed, each car a testament to efficiency and affordability. The ripple effect was immense. New industries sprang up to support the automotive craze: rubber for tires, steel for chassis, glass for windows, oil for fuel, and countless miles of new roads to drive upon. Gas stations, diners, and motels began to dot the burgeoning highway system, creating entirely new economic ecosystems. Beyond the automobile, the home itself was being revolutionized. Electricity, no longer a novelty, became a ubiquitous force, powering a dizzying array of new appliances. Washing machines liberated women from hours of back-breaking labor over wash tubs. Refrigerators replaced iceboxes, preserving food and changing dietary habits. Vacuum cleaners made housework less arduous. The radio, a marvel of modern technology, brought entertainment, news, and advertising directly into living rooms, creating a shared national experience. Families gathered around their sets, listening to presidential addresses, baseball games, and popular music, fostering a sense of national unity and shared cultural identity. This proliferation of goods was not just about convenience, it was about aspiration. Advertising, a nascent industry before the war, now exploded, creating desires and shaping perceptions. Glossy magazines and newspaper ads showcased the latest gadgets, subtly suggesting that ownership was not just about utility, but about status, happiness, and belonging. The message was clear. Prosperity was not just for the elite, it was for everyone, and it was available now. Crucially, this new consumer paradise was often financed by a revolutionary concept: installment buying. Buy now, pay later became the mantra of the decade. For the first time, ordinary Americans could purchase big-ticket items, cars, radios, furniture, without having to save up the full amount beforehand. This system, while fueling demand and keeping factories humming, also introduced a new level of debt into the average household. It was a testament to the prevailing optimism. People believed their wages would continue to rise, allowing them to comfortably meet their monthly payments. The idea of deferred gratification seemed quaint in an era where immediate satisfaction was the new norm. This widespread access to credit, both for consumer goods and more dangerously for investments, would prove to be a double-edged sword, laying a foundation of vulnerability beneath the glittering edifice of prosperity. As the decade progressed, the economic boom found its most dazzling and ultimately most perilous expression in the stock market. What had once been the exclusive domain of wealthy industrialists and seasoned financiers now beckoned to the masses. Stories of ordinary individuals, secretaries, chauffeurs, barbers, who had made fortunes overnight, became common lore, fueling a collective delusion that the stock market was a guaranteed path to riches. It was no longer just about investing in solid companies. It was about speculation, about buying shares not for their intrinsic value or long-term dividends, but simply because their price was expected to rise, allowing for a quick profit. The market became a national obsession, a topic of conversation at dinner tables, barber shops, and social gatherings. Ticker tape machines, once confined to brokerage houses, began appearing in hotels, restaurants, and even drugstores, their relentless clicking a hypnotic soundtrack to the era's ambition. People who had never owned a share of stock in their lives suddenly found themselves poring over financial pages, discussing obscure companies with newfound expertise. The allure was irresistible, and the mechanism that made it accessible to so many was buying on margin. This was the financial equivalent of installment buying for consumer goods, but with far greater leverage and risk. In essence, buying on margin meant purchasing stocks with borrowed money. An investor would put down only a small percentage of the stock's actual price, often as little as 10%, and borrow the rest from their broker. The broker, in turn, borrowed the money from banks. If the stock price rose, the investor's profit was magnified, as they were making money on the full value of the shares, with only a fraction of their own capital invested. For example, if you bought $1,000 worth of stock with only $100 of your own money, 10% margin, and the stock went up by 10%, your $1,000 investment would now be worth $100. Your profit would be $100, effectively a 100% return on your initial $100 outlay, minus interest and commissions. This seemed like a miraculous way to get rich quickly, and countless individuals, emboldened by the seemingly endless upward trend of the market, jumped in with both feet. However, the flip side of this leverage was devastating. If the stock price fell even slightly, the losses were also magnified. If that same $1,000 stock bought on 10% margin dropped by just $10 to $900, the investor's entire $100 initial investment would be wiped out. Worse, if the stock continued to fall, the broker would issue a margin call, demanding that the investor deposit more money to cover the loss and maintain the required margin percentage. If the investor couldn't meet the margin call, the broker would sell their shares, often at a significant loss, to recoup the borrowed money. This mechanism created a dangerous feedback loop. A falling market would trigger margin calls, forcing more selling, which would drive prices down further, triggering more margin calls, and so on. In the heady days of the late 1920s, however, such a scenario seemed impossible. The market, it was widely believed, would only ever go up. This pervasive belief in perpetual prosperity was the cornerstone of the New Era philosophy. Influential economists, industrialists, and even government officials publicly declared that the United States had entered a new economic age, one free from the historical constraints of boom and bust cycles. Herbert Hoover, before becoming president, famously declared in 1928 that America was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. Such pronouncements, echoed in newspapers and popular magazines, reinforced the public's conviction that the good times would never end. Any voices of caution or dissent were largely dismissed as old-fashioned, pessimistic, or simply failing to grasp the unique genius of the American economic model. The stock market, in this view, was not merely reflecting prosperity, it was actively creating it, a self-sustaining engine of wealth generation. This boundless optimism was tragically coupled with an almost complete lack of effective regulation in the financial markets. The federal government's approach to the economy was largely laissez-faire, a hands-off philosophy that believed the market would regulate itself. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) to oversee stock exchanges, no federal body to enforce transparency or prevent manipulation. Stock exchanges operated largely under their own rules, which were often inadequate to protect investors. Practices that would later be deemed illegal were commonplace. Pools, for instance, were groups of wealthy investors who would conspire to artificially inflate the price of a stock by buying and selling it among themselves, creating the illusion of high demand. Once the price had risen sufficiently, they would dump their shares on unsuspecting public investors, leaving them with worthless stock. Insider trading was rampant, and information was often withheld or manipulated for personal gain. The absence of clear rules and robust oversight created an environment ripe for abuse and speculation, where the unwary were easily separated from their money. The banking system, too, operated with insufficient regulation and a dangerous degree of interconnectedness with the speculative stock market. Banks eager to profit from the booming market lent vast sums of money to brokers, who then lent it to investors for margin purchases. These call loans were short-term and could be recalled by the banks at a moment's notice. While this seemed safe during an upward trend, it meant that if banks suddenly needed their money back, brokers would have to issue margin calls, leading to forced selling and a rapid decline in stock prices. Furthermore, banks were often heavily invested in the stock market themselves, or had made loans to companies whose fortunes were tied to the market's performance. There was no federal deposit insurance to protect depositors' savings, meaning that a bank failure could wipe out a lifetime of savings for ordinary citizens. This fragile and interconnected financial structure, built on a foundation of easy credit and speculative fervor, was a ticking time bomb waiting for a trigger. Prominent figures of the era embodied this spirit of audacious ambition, and in some cases, reckless disregard for risk. Charles Ponzi, though his infamous scheme predated the peak of the boom, symbolized the allure of impossible returns. More relevant to the stock market, figures like Jesse Livermore, the legendary boy plunger of Wall Street, made and lost fortunes through speculation, embodying the high-stakes gamble of the market. While Livermore was a master of his craft, his very existence highlighted the speculative nature of the game. Even ordinary citizens, swept up in the frenzy, became characters in this grand drama. The stories of newfound wealth were intoxicating, creating a powerful social pressure to participate. Neighbors compared stock tips, friends boasted of their paper profits, and anyone not in the market felt left behind, missing out on the greatest wealth-generating opportunity in history. This collective psychology, a blend of greed, optimism, and fear of missing out, became a powerful engine driving the market ever higher, seemingly defying gravity. Yet even amidst the dazzling display of prosperity, subtle cracks were beginning to appear, largely ignored by the majority caught in the speculative fever. While urban centers thrived, American agriculture had been in a depression for much of the decade. Farmers who had expanded production to meet wartime demand found themselves facing plummeting prices and mounting debts in the post-war era. The textile and coal industries also struggled, facing competition and declining demand. Income inequality, though not a widely discussed topic at the time, was growing, meaning that the benefits of the boom were not evenly distributed. A significant portion of the population remained in poverty or struggled to make ends meet, while a relatively small segment of society accumulated vast wealth. This imbalance meant that the consumer base, while expanding due to credit, was not as robust as it appeared, and the ability of the average American to absorb an endless supply of goods was finite. These underlying economic weaknesses, masked by the roaring stock market, would prove critical when the speculative bubble finally burst. The 1920s, therefore, was not merely a decade of economic growth. It was a profound cultural moment, defined by a radical shift in attitudes towards wealth, risk, and the future. The collective memory often distills it to images of flappers and jazz, but its true essence lay in the intoxicating belief that prosperity was not just a possibility, but a permanent state of being, a natural right for every American. This belief, fueled by technological innovation, mass production, and the seductive power of credit, found its ultimate expression in a stock market that seemed to defy all logic and historical precedent. The widespread embrace of margin buying, The absence of regulatory oversight and the interconnectedness of the financial system created a colossal house of cards, built on a foundation of debt and an almost childlike faith in unending growth. No one, it seemed, wanted to hear the whispers of caution, the faint rumblings beneath the surface of the Roaring Twenties. The party was too good, the music too loud, and the promise of easy riches too alluring to be disturbed by the inconvenient truths of economic reality. This was the stage, meticulously set by a decade of unbridled optimism and unchecked speculation, for the dramatic and devastating events that were soon to unfold. The very forces that propelled America to unprecedented heights of wealth and confidence were simultaneously weaving the threads of its undoing, preparing the ground for a fall that would reverberate through generations. The foundation had been laid, not of solid rock, but of speculative sand. As the 1920s roared on, the seemingly endless symphony of prosperity began to play a discordant note, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. While the urban centers and the stock market basked in an almost blinding glow of optimism, beneath the surface, and in less visible corners of the nation, cracks in the economic facade were beginning to show. These were not sudden fissures, but rather slow, insidious erosions, often dismissed or ignored by those caught in the intoxicating rush of the new era. Yet for those willing to look, the warning signs were increasingly evident, painting a picture of an economy built on an increasingly precarious foundation. Perhaps the most persistent and widespread of these cracks was the plight of American agriculture. While the factories of the cities hummed with unprecedented production, the nation's farmers had been in a state of depression for much of the decade, long before the urban boom began to falter. During World War I, American farmers had been called upon to feed a war-torn Europe, expanding their acreage and investing heavily in new machinery to meet the soaring demand. Prices for their crops had been high, and many took out loans, confident in a future of continued prosperity. However, once the war ended, European agriculture slowly began to recover, and demand for American foodstuffs plummeted. Simultaneously, technological advancements continued to increase agricultural output, leading to a massive oversupply. The result was a devastating drop in commodity prices. Wheat, corn, cotton, and livestock prices fell sharply, often below the cost of production. Farmers, burdened by the debts incurred during the war and facing shrinking incomes, found themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. Thousands lost their farms to foreclosure, contributing to a quiet but profound rural exodus. This agricultural distress, though geographically isolated from the bustling financial centers, represented a significant segment of the American economy that was already in deep trouble, a stark contrast to the perceived national affluence. Beyond agriculture, other traditional industries also experienced significant struggles. The coal industry, for example, faced stiff competition from newer energy sources like oil and natural gas, leading to mine closures and widespread unemployment in coal-producing regions. The textile industry, particularly in New England, suffered from overproduction and competition from cheaper labor in the South, resulting in factory shutdowns and economic hardship for mill workers. These localized depressions, while not immediately threatening the overall economic narrative of prosperity, indicated a lack of uniform growth and highlighted sectors that were failing to participate in the new era boom. They were early indicators that the prosperity was not as broad-based or as robust as many believed. Meanwhile, the very engine of consumerism, which had fueled so much of the decade's growth, was also showing signs of strain. The widespread adoption of installment buying, while initially a boon, was accumulating a significant amount of consumer debt. Many households, eager to acquire the latest appliances or automobiles, stretched their budgets thin, committing a large portion of their future income to monthly payments. As the decade wore on, the ability of the average American family to take on more debt or to purchase more goods began to reach its limit. The market for new cars and radios, while still strong, was showing signs of saturation. This meant that the demand that had driven production might not be sustainable indefinitely, and factories, if they continued to produce at the same rate, would soon face an inventory surplus. The speculative fever in the stock market, far from being a sign of robust economic health, was increasingly becoming a dangerous symptom of imbalance. Money that might otherwise have been invested in productive enterprises, building new factories, developing new technologies, or expanding existing businesses, was instead being channeled into the stock market, chasing quick profits. Corporations themselves, rather than reinvesting their profits into their core businesses, often found it more lucrative to lend money to brokers for call loans, further fueling the speculative bubble. This diversion of capital away from productive investment and towards speculative trading was a fundamental distortion of the economic system, prioritizing financial gains over real economic growth. The Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, watched these developments with growing concern, but its actions were often hesitant, contradictory, or insufficient. Some within the Fed recognized the dangers of excessive speculation and advocated for raising interest rates to curb the flow of credit into the stock market. However, others feared that raising rates too aggressively might stifle legitimate business activity or trigger a recession. This internal debate and lack of decisive action meant that the Federal Reserve largely stood by as the speculative bubble inflated. When they did act, their measures were often too little, too late, or misinterpreted by a market that had become accustomed to easy money. International economic conditions also played a critical, though often overlooked, role in setting the stage for the crash. The intricate web of war debts and reparations, established after World War I, created a fragile global financial system. Germany was burdened with massive reparation payments to the Allied powers, who in turn owed substantial war debts to the United States. This circular flow of money relied heavily on American loans to Germany. If American lending slowed or stopped, the entire system could collapse, disrupting international trade and financial stability. As the decade progressed, the ability of European nations to repay their debts became increasingly precarious, adding another layer of fragility to the global economic landscape. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, passed in 1930 but debated throughout the late 1920s, further exacerbated these international tensions by raising tariffs on imported goods, inviting retaliatory tariffs from other nations, and stifling global trade precisely when it was most needed. Despite these mounting signs of vulnerability, the prevailing narrative remained one of unshakable confidence. Warnings from a few prescient economists and financial experts were largely dismissed as alarmist or out of touch. Roger Babson, a statistician, famously predicted a crash in September 1929, only to be widely ridiculed. Even prominent figures like Yale economist Irving Fisher, known for his work on monetary theory, declared just days before the crash that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. Such pronouncements, coming from respected authorities, served to reinforce the public's conviction that the market was safe and that any downturns would be minor and temporary. The psychological momentum of the boom was simply too powerful to be easily swayed by rational analysis or historical precedent. The sheer volume of credit flowing into the stock market was staggering. Banks and corporations, finding it more profitable to lend money for speculative purposes than for traditional business investments, poured billions into call loans. By 1929, the amount of money borrowed for stock purchases reached unprecedented levels, creating a vast pool of debt that underpinned the soaring market prices. This reliance on borrowed money meant that the market's stability was directly tied to the continued willingness of lenders to provide credit and the ability of borrowers to repay it. Any disruption to this delicate balance, any sudden withdrawal of funds, could trigger a chain reaction of devastating consequences. The irrational exuberance, a term coined much later but perfectly descriptive of the era, reached its zenith in People were not just investing, they were gambling, convinced that they could not lose. The market became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Prices rose because everyone expected them to rise, drawing in more and more investors, further inflating the bubble. The underlying value of many companies seemed to matter less than the daily fluctuations of their stock price. The focus was entirely on capital gains, on buying low and selling high, with little regard for dividends or long-term growth. This speculative frenzy created an environment where asset prices became detached from their fundamental economic realities, making the market extraordinarily vulnerable to any shift in sentiment. In essence, the late 1920s saw a dangerous confluence of factors: a largely unregulated financial system, an over-reliance on debt for both consumption and investment, a struggling agricultural sector, and a global economy teetering on the brink of instability due to war debts. All of these vulnerabilities were obscured by the dazzling performance of the stock market and the pervasive belief in a new era of perpetual prosperity. The warnings were there, subtle at first, then increasingly clear, but they were drowned out by the roar of the 20s, by the ticker tape, and by the siren song of easy riches. The stage was set, not just for a correction, but for a catastrophic collapse, as the cracks in the facade widened, threatening to bring down the entire edifice built on speculative sand. The optimism that had defined the decade was about to face its ultimate test, and the consequences would be far more severe than anyone could have imagined. The year 1929 began with the stock market continuing its seemingly unstoppable ascent, reaching dizzying new heights. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, a barometer of industrial health, had surged from around 100 points in the early 1920s to over 380 by September 19. The New Era philosophy, which posited an unending era of prosperity and ever-rising stock prices, was firmly entrenched in the public consciousness. Millions of Americans, from seasoned financiers to ordinary citizens, had poured their savings and often borrowed money into the market, convinced that they were participating in a guaranteed path to wealth. The air was thick with optimism, yet beneath this veneer of confidence, the economic vulnerabilities discussed in the previous chapter were silently accumulating, like kindling around a roaring fire. The first tremors of instability began subtly in early September. The market, after its spectacular rise, started to show signs of fatigue. Prices began to fluctuate more wildly, and there were a few days of significant declines, though these were quickly dismissed as minor corrections or healthy pauses in the upward trend. Investors, conditioned by years of relentless gains, saw these dips as buying opportunities, eager to buy the dip and profit from the inevitable rebound. This ingrained optimism, however, prevented many from recognizing the true significance of these early warning signals. The market had become so inflated, so detached from fundamental economic realities, that it was poised for a dramatic fall. Then came Thursday, October 24, 1929. A day that would forever be etched into financial history as Black Thursday. The morning opened with a wave of selling that quickly overwhelmed the market. The volume of shares traded was unprecedented, far exceeding the capacity of the antiquated ticker tape machines to keep up. Prices plummeted at an alarming rate, and panic began to spread like wildfire. The ticker, which normally reported transactions within minutes, fell hours behind, leaving investors and brokers in a terrifying state of uncertainty, unsure of the true value of their holdings. This delay only intensified the fear, as rumors of catastrophic losses circulated wildly. The initial selling was triggered by a variety of factors. Some large institutional investors, sensing the precariousness of the market, began to liquidate their positions. Others were forced to sell as their brokers issued margin calls, demanding more collateral to cover their leveraged positions. As prices fell, more margin calls were issued, creating a vicious cycle of forced selling that accelerated the decline. The market was not just correcting, it was unraveling. In a desperate attempt to stem the tide, a consortium of leading Wall Street bankers, including Thomas W. Lamont of J.P. Morgan & Co., Charles E. Mitchell of National City Bank, and Albert H. Wiggin of Chase National Bank, met at the offices of J.P. Morgan. Their goal was to restore confidence and prevent a complete collapse. They pooled their resources and appointed Richard Whitney, the vice president of the New York Stock Exchange, to make a highly visible show of support. At midday, Whitney walked onto the floor of the exchange and, in a dramatic gesture, placed a large order to buy shares of U.S. Steel, significantly above its current market price. He then proceeded to place similar large orders for other blue-chip stocks. Whitney's actions had an immediate, albeit temporary, calming effect. The sight of a major figure confidently buying shares seemed to reassure some investors, and the market rallied slightly in the afternoon. The day ended with a massive loss, but not the complete meltdown that had seemed imminent hours earlier. Newspapers the next day reported a sense of relief, portraying the bankers' intervention as a heroic act that had saved the market. Many believed the worst was over, and that the market would now stabilize and begin its recovery. This brief respite, however, was merely the calm before the storm. The weekend that followed Black Thursday provided a deceptive sense of calm. While the financial world breathed a collective sigh of relief, the underlying problems remained. Investors who had managed to hold on to their shares over the weekend faced a grim reality. The market was still fundamentally overvalued, and the fear of further losses lingered. Many used the weekend to reflect on their precarious positions, especially those who had bought heavily on margin. The sense of invincibility that had characterized the new era was beginning to crack, replaced by a growing unease. Then came Tuesday, October 29, 1929, a day that would forever be known as Black Tuesday. This was the true catastrophic climax of the crash. The market opened with an even more intense wave of selling than Black Thursday. This time there was no organized effort by bankers to intervene effectively, or if there was, it was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sell orders. Panic gripped the exchange floor. Brokers shouted themselves hoarse, trying to execute orders, but there were simply no buyers for many stocks. Prices plunged vertically, wiping out fortunes in minutes. The ticker tape, already hours behind, became completely useless, providing no real-time information. Investors across the country watched in horror as the value of their portfolios evaporated. The scenes on Wall Street were chaotic. Crowds gathered outside the exchange, desperate for news, while inside, brokers and clerks worked frantically, many collapsing from exhaustion and despair. The psychological impact was immense. Years of accumulated wealth, both real and paper, vanished in a matter of hours. The dream of endless prosperity turned into a nightmare of financial ruin. The scale of the losses on Black Tuesday was staggering. An estimated 16 million shares were traded, a record that would stand for decades, but it was predominantly a selling spree. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 12% of its value in a single day, following a 13% drop on Black Monday, October 28th. In just 2 days, the market had shed billions of dollars in value, far exceeding the entire cost of World War I. Companies that had been pillars of American industry saw their stock prices collapse, often falling to a fraction of their peak values. The mechanics of margin buying, which had fueled the boom, now accelerated the bust. As stock prices plummeted, brokers issued a flood of margin calls. Investors who couldn't meet these calls were forced to sell their shares, regardless of the price, to cover their debts. This forced selling flooded the market with even more shares, driving prices down further and triggering yet more margin calls. It was a brutal, self-reinforcing downward spiral. Many investors not only lost their initial investments, but also found themselves deeply in debt to their brokers and banks. The immediate aftermath on Wall Street was one of shock and disbelief. The streets were filled with stunned investors, some weeping openly, others in a state of numb despair. The once bustling brokerage houses were scenes of chaos, as employees tried to process the avalanche of transactions and communicate with their devastated clients. The myth of the permanently high plateau had been shattered with brutal finality. The market, far from being an infallible engine of wealth, had revealed itself to be a fragile, interconnected system, vulnerable to the very speculative forces it had fostered. The crash was not a single event, but a series of devastating days that culminated in Black Tuesday, while the market would continue to decline in the weeks and months that followed. The period from Black Thursday to Black Tuesday marked the definitive end of the Roaring Twenties economic euphoria. It was the moment when the speculative bubble, inflated by years of easy credit, unregulated practices, and boundless optimism, finally burst with cataclysmic force. The wealth that had seemed so real, so tangible, had largely been an illusion, a paper fortune built on borrowed money and unsustainable expectations. The collapse was not just a financial event, it was a profound psychological shock, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of a long, painful reckoning for the American economy and its people. The dust had barely settled on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange after Black Tuesday, but the tremors of the crash were already spreading far beyond Wall Street, sending shockwaves through every corner of American society and across the globe. The immediate aftermath of the 1929 stock market collapse was not a swift rebound, as many had optimistically hoped, but a brutal and relentless descent into economic despair. The illusion of a new era of permanent prosperity was shattered, replaced by a grim reality of vanishing wealth, widespread unemployment, and a profound crisis of confidence. One of the most immediate and devastating consequences of the crash was a wave of bank failures. The banking system of the 1920s was largely unregulated and highly fragmented, with thousands of small independent banks, Many of these banks had invested heavily in the stock market themselves, or had made substantial call loans to brokers and investors for margin purchases. When the market crashed, these loans became worthless, leaving banks with massive losses. Furthermore, as news of the crash spread, a pervasive fear gripped the public, a fear that their savings were no longer safe. This led to widespread bank runs, where panicked depositors rushed to withdraw their money, often overwhelming the bank's reserves. Banks, unable to meet the sudden demand for withdrawals, were forced to close their doors, often permanently. With no federal deposit insurance at the time, depositors lost everything they had saved. A lifetime of hard work and careful saving could vanish overnight, leaving families destitute. The failure of one bank often triggered panic in neighboring communities, leading to more runs and more closures, creating a terrifying domino effect across the nation. This destruction of savings not only wiped out individual wealth, but also severely crippled the nation's credit system, making it nearly impossible for businesses to borrow money for expansion or even for day-to-day operations. The closure of banks meant that businesses could not secure the short-term loans needed for payroll or inventory, forcing them to scale back or shut down entirely. Farmers, already struggling, found their lines of credit cut off, unable to secure funds for planting or harvesting, pushing many further into ruin and foreclosure. The very arteries of commerce began to seize up, starved of the financial lifeblood they needed to function. As credit dried up and consumer demand plummeted due to lost wealth and widespread fear, businesses across the country began to falter. Factories that had once hummed with activity now slowed production, cut wages, and eventually laid off workers. Companies that had expanded rapidly during the boom found themselves with massive inventories and no buyers. Business bankruptcies soared, leading to further job losses. The unemployment rate, which had been relatively low during the 1920s, began a relentless climb, transforming from a minor concern into a national crisis. From the textile mills of New England to the automotive plants of Michigan, the gears of industry ground to a halt. Small businesses, the backbone of many local economies, were particularly vulnerable, lacking the reserves to weather the sudden downturn. Storefronts became vacant, and the vibrant commercial streets of American towns grew eerily quiet. Millions of Americans, who had once enjoyed stable employment and a rising standard of living, suddenly found themselves jobless, with no safety net. There was no widespread unemployment insurance, no federal welfare programs. Families faced eviction from their homes, struggled to put food on the table, and endured the profound psychological toll of joblessness and destitution. The sight of long lines at soup kitchens and bread lines became a stark symbol of the new reality. Men, once proud providers, were reduced to selling apples on street corners or riding the rails in search of work, their dignity eroded by the relentless economic hardship. Women, too, faced increasing pressure, often taking on low-wage domestic work or factory jobs, if available, to supplement dwindling family incomes. Children, malnourished and often pulled from school, bore the silent burden of their families' struggles, their childhoods curtailed by the harsh realities of the Depression. The once bright promise of the American dream faded into a daily struggle for survival. The psychological impact of the crash was arguably as devastating as the financial one. The boundless optimism and belief in the new era that had defined the 1920s evaporated almost overnight, replaced by widespread despair, fear, and a profound sense of betrayal. People who had seen their life savings disappear, or who had lost their jobs, felt a deep sense of injustice and hopelessness. The American dream, once seemingly within reach for so many, now felt like a cruel mirage. Stories of suicides among ruined investors, though perhaps exaggerated in popular lore, reflected the very real emotional trauma inflicted by the sudden loss of wealth and status. Confidence, the intangible but essential lubricant of any economy, had been shattered. Consumers stopped spending, businesses stopped investing, and banks stopped lending, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of contraction. This loss of faith extended beyond personal finance. It eroded trust in institutions, in government, and in the very capitalist system that had seemed so robust just months before. A deep-seated anxiety about the future settled over the nation, replacing the carefree exuberance of the Jazz Age with a pervasive sense of dread. The initial responses from government and financial institutions were largely inadequate, hampered by a limited understanding of the crisis's scale and a prevailing belief in traditional economic principles. President Herbert Hoover, who had taken office just months before the crash, initially downplayed its severity, believing it to be a temporary market correction that would soon resolve itself. His administration adhered to a philosophy of limited government intervention, believing that direct federal aid would undermine individual initiative and create dependency. Instead, Hoover emphasized voluntary cooperation among businesses and local charities to address the growing crisis. He called upon industrialists to maintain wages and employment, and urged philanthropists to increase their donations. While well-intentioned, these appeals proved insufficient against the tidal wave of economic collapse. The sheer scale of unemployment and poverty quickly overwhelmed the capacity of private charities and local governments, leaving millions without adequate assistance. The Federal Reserve, still finding its footing as a central bank, also struggled to respond effectively. Its actions were often hesitant and contradictory. Some officials still feared reigniting speculation if they lowered interest rates too much, while others worried about the stability of the dollar. The lack of a clear, coordinated monetary policy meant that the Fed failed to inject sufficient liquidity into the banking system when it was desperately needed, exacerbating the bank runs and credit crunch. Instead of acting as a lender of last resort to struggling banks, the Fed often stood by, allowing solvent but illiquid institutions to fail, further deepening the crisis of confidence and contracting the money supply. This inaction, rooted in a rigid adherence to orthodox economic theories and an underestimation of the crisis's systemic nature, proved to be a critical misstep, allowing a financial panic to metastasize into a full-blown economic depression. The ripple effects of the crash quickly spread beyond American borders, turning a national crisis into a global economic catastrophe. The intricate web of international finance, particularly the war debts and reparations system, proved to be a major conduit for contagion. As American banks failed and credit dried up, U.S. lending to European nations, especially Germany, ceased abruptly. Without these American loans, Germany could not make its reparation payments to the Allied powers, who in turn could not repay their war debts to the United States. This created a chain reaction of defaults and financial instability across Europe. Banks in Austria and Germany collapsed, triggering further panic and a credit freeze throughout the continent. The global credit crunch led to a sharp decline in international trade. Nations, facing their own economic woes, resorted to protectionist policies, raising tariffs on imported goods in an attempt to protect domestic industries. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, passed by the U.S. in 1930, was a prime example, triggering retaliatory tariffs from other countries and further choking off global commerce. As trade volumes plummeted, businesses worldwide suffered, leading to more layoffs and deepening the global depression. The interconnectedness of the world economy, which had facilitated the spread of prosperity in the 1920s, now ensured that the American crash would drag the rest of the world into a prolonged and painful economic downturn, creating a vicious cycle of declining demand and rising unemployment on an international scale. The optimistic vision of a globalized, interdependent economy, so central to the new era, crumbled under the weight of national self-interest and financial collapse. In the immediate wake of Black Tuesday, the full scope of the disaster was still unfolding, but the signs were unmistakable. The stock market crash was not merely a financial event, it was a catalyst that exposed the deep-seated vulnerabilities of the American and global economies. It triggered a cascade of bank failures, business closures, and mass unemployment, plunging millions into poverty and despair. The initial responses were insufficient, and the international ramifications ensured that the crisis would not remain confined to American shores. The Roaring Twenties had ended with a deafening crash, leaving behind a landscape of economic ruin and a profound sense of uncertainty about the future. This was the grim prelude to the Great Depression, a period of hardship that would redefine the role of government and fundamentally alter the course of American history. The stock market crash of October 1929 was without doubt a cataclysmic event, a sudden and brutal end to the new era of prosperity. Yet it was not in itself the Great Depression. Rather, it was the trigger, the initial shock that exposed and exacerbated deep-seated vulnerabilities within the American and global economies. This shock set in motion a chain of events that would plunge the world into a decade of unprecedented hardship. The period immediately following Black Tuesday, was characterized by a desperate search for answers and solutions. However, the prevailing economic wisdom and the ingrained political philosophies of the time proved tragically inadequate to stem the deepening crisis. One of the most significant factors preventing a quick recovery was the global adherence to the gold standard. In the early 20th century, most major economies, including the United States, pegged their currencies to a fixed amount of gold. While intended to provide stability, the gold standard severely limited the ability of central banks, like the Federal Reserve, to respond flexibly to economic crises. When a country faced a recession or a financial panic, the traditional response would be to lower interest rates and increase the money supply to stimulate economic activity. However, under the gold standard, if a central bank increased the money supply, it risked depleting its gold reserves as people exchanged currency for gold. This could potentially force the abandonment of the standard. This fear of abandoning gold led central banks to prioritize maintaining their gold reserves, often by raising interest rates or keeping them high. This was precisely the opposite of what was needed to combat deflation and stimulate lending during a downturn. This rigid monetary policy acted as a straitjacket, preventing the necessary liquidity injections and credit expansion that could have eased the crisis. Compounding the monetary rigidity was a disastrous turn towards protectionist trade policies. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed into law in June 1930, was a prime example of this economic nationalism. Driven by a desire to protect American farmers and industries from foreign competition, the act raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record high levels. The intention was to encourage Americans to buy domestic products, thereby stimulating the national economy. However, the immediate and devastating effect was widespread international retaliation. Other countries, facing their own economic difficulties and angered by the U.S. tariffs, quickly imposed their own retaliatory tariffs on American goods. This ignited a global trade war, causing international trade volumes to plummet by more than 50% between 19. American farmers and manufacturers who had hoped for protection found their export markets vanishing, further deepening the economic contraction and exacerbating unemployment. The flow of goods and capital across borders, which had been a hallmark of the 1920s boom, virtually ceased, trapping nations in their own economic woes. The initial response of President Herbert Hoover's administration, rooted in a strong belief in individualism and limited government intervention, proved insufficient against the unprecedented scale of the crisis. Hoover believed that direct federal relief would undermine the American spirit of self-reliance and create a permanent class of dependents. He emphasized voluntary cooperation among businesses, urging them to maintain wages and employment, and appealed to private charities and local governments to provide relief for the needy. He initiated some public works projects, like the construction of the Hoover Dam, and established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation (RFC) in 1932 to provide emergency loans to banks, railroads, and other large businesses. However, these measures were often too little, too late, and too narrowly focused. The RFC, for instance, primarily aided large institutions, while millions of ordinary Americans faced starvation and homelessness. The sheer magnitude of unemployment and poverty quickly overwhelmed the capacity of local charities and state governments, leaving millions without any form of adequate assistance. The image of Hooverville's shanty towns built by the homeless on the outskirts of cities became a bitter symbol of the administration's perceived inaction and the widespread suffering. As the Depression deepened, the social fabric of the nation began to fray. Mass unemployment led to widespread poverty, hunger, and homelessness. Families were torn apart as men left home in search of work, becoming hobos riding the rails. Malnutrition and disease became more prevalent, particularly among children. The birth rate declined, and marriage rates fell. The psychological toll was immense, marked by feelings of shame, failure, and despair. The once vibrant optimism of the 1920s was replaced by a pervasive sense of hopelessness and a growing frustration with the government's inability to alleviate the suffering. Social unrest began to simmer, with protests and demonstrations becoming more common as people demanded action from their leaders. The crisis also highlighted the profound inequalities that had been masked by the prosperity of the African Americans, already facing systemic discrimination, were often the last hired, first fired, and suffered disproportionately from unemployment and poverty. Migrant workers, particularly those fleeing the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains, faced immense hardship and discrimination as they sought work in California. The Depression laid bare the stark realities of class, race, and regional disparities, forcing a national reckoning with the uneven distribution of wealth and opportunity. The prolonged nature of the Depression and the perceived failure of traditional approaches ultimately led to a growing demand for more radical government intervention. The public's disillusionment with Hoover's policies paved the way for a dramatic political shift. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, campaigning on a promise of a New Deal for the American people, overwhelmingly defeated Hoover in the presidential election. Roosevelt's election marked a fundamental turning point, signaling a profound redefinition of the role of government in American life. The Great Depression, therefore, was not simply the result of the stock market crash, but a complex interplay of factors. The speculative excesses of the 1920s, the fragile international financial system, the rigidities of the gold standard, misguided protectionist policies, and an initial governmental response that proved inadequate to the crisis's scale. The crash was the catalyst, but the subsequent years of hardship were shaped by a series of economic and policy decisions, or in some cases, the lack thereof. The legacy of the 1929 crash and the ensuing Great Depression was profound. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the American people and their government, leading to the establishment of a social safety net, increased regulation of the financial markets, and a greater acceptance of government intervention in the economy. It taught painful lessons about the dangers of unchecked speculation, the importance of financial regulation, and the interconnectedness of the global economy. The Roaring Twenties had ended in a devastating silence, but from its ashes, a new, more regulated, and more socially conscious America would eventually begin to emerge.